Justus, please give a better guidance on how, when you are asking for financing, how do these rates affect a business when they are finding capital?
Yeah, there is quite a bit of impact. Yeah, because you see, it all boils down to what is the cost of capital. And as an SME, that's a key issue to look at. Otherwise, you'll be making losses at the end of the day, and that's what you don't want. So, just for information, they say inflation is the persistent rise in the price of commodities. So, for example, we have what we call the general cost of borrowing within the market. In our case in Kenya, central bank usually pronounces itself on what the cost of borrowing will be between the central bank and commercial banks. That spills itself over into the market, and it determines at what interest rate are banks going to lend to the wider public. And if you extend it further, the rate at which, for example, an SME is going to borrow at has to take account of all those factors, including inflation. And inflation usually is a component that adds up to the cost of borrowing. So if, for example, an SME wanted to borrow funds, maybe the target was 13%, it has to add an inflation component of, say, 2-3%, depending on how the market is, or can I say how the economy is. So it's a big factor that ultimately determines what decision is going to be made. In fact, for our market, I think the current rates should be anything between maybe 19 and maybe up to 25%. I think Elizabeth is better placed to tell us what is the rate in the banking sector. It's a key issue for our market. Although, of course, people have been saying there's a time in Kenya when interest rates were in the 80%. I don't know whether 1980s or 90s, which is something very prohibitive. But generally speaking, I think best would be to look at, so what options do I have? And I think I go back to the various alternatives that people have, so that you can compare, which then means today's source of financing for you may not necessarily be the same tomorrow. And as we said, awareness is a very central factor here. Once you're aware that, for example, the banking sector, and even within the banking sector, different commercial banks are offering loans at different rates. If you come to capital markets, there is what I could call the pitch deck, similar to what Melissa has already indicated, and we call it an information memorandum, which is a document detailing who you are, where you are from, what business you do, what risks you're facing, what are your financials, So then that document can be used as your pledge on what you're going to do. Can I call it a promise if you are given the funds you are trying to access? But also coming to the other factors around what affects borrowing and the cost of accessing capital by SMEs, there's also the issue around foreign currency fluctuation. A lot of SMEs import some of their inputs that are used in either manufacturing or even as a finished product. Ultimately, a very small change in the Kenya shilling versus the foreign currencies, be it the euro, or the USD, or whichever other, has a serious impact on the cost at which the SME is going to get that currency. Ultimately, the cost at which it's going to sell its final product. What needs to be done is to be very consistent in informing the key stakeholders that the very fact that there are very slight changes in the business environment has a huge impact on what is happening in terms of business activity, especially for SMEs, because the access capital is already a challenge. And then there's an additional cost that comes in with either interest rate fluctuation or foreign currency or other factors that are beyond the control of the SME, but within the control of government. So those are issues that perhaps even as SME founders, aviation, and other players, will need to they'll need to keep knocking that door and say, yes, we understand, of course, government wants to raise revenue, but the environment has to be very favorable for business to thrive. For big companies, perhaps sometimes they can take up some of that cost, but for SMEs, you're trying to leapfrog yourself so then you can get where the big companies are before you can also be comfortable. Ultimately, a lot of discussions and advocacy work around exactly what is happening and creating awareness as to the impact of some of the actions taken by other stakeholders that have an impact on the SME sector. If that is highlighted, loudly enough and consistently enough, perhaps that environment will be favorable for SMEs, so then they can be able to raise capital.